Hello, I'm Morgan Jorgensen. I'm the Donor Relations and Events Manager for the Truman Library Institute. Welcome to the Potsdam Conference, 75 years later. This is the latest installment in our series of digital programming commemorating the 75th anniversary of Truman's presidency. Tonight's program features Michael Neiberg, the Foundation Chair of War Studies in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the United States Army War College, and author of the book Potsdam, The End of World War II and the Remaking of Europe, winner of the Truman Book Award in 2016. I'd like to take a moment to thank Mary and John Hunkler, who endowed the Book Award program with a generous gift to our capital campaign, and who are watching this program tonight. Mary and John, thank you for your long-standing support of the Institute. At the conclusion of the 40-minute presentation, there will be a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. Questions can be submitted during and immediately following the remarks via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Michael Neiberg.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Let me start by thanking Lisa Sullivan and Morgan Jorgensen for all of their help in getting this set up. And Marion John, since you're here, thank you as well for all of your support. We are, as Morgan mentioned, we are at the 75th anniversary of the Potsdam Conference. Big numbers like a 75th anniversary or a 100th anniversary are always occasions for looking back and for drawing attention. I think there's another reason to look back at Potsdam, as we are in our own day and age re-entering a world of great power competition and re-entering a world where geopolitics seems to have come back to the fore of international thinking and international relations thinking. So it's well worth us coming back to this subject. So I'm especially glad to have a chance to talk to you about it. I wish it was in person again in Kansas City. I wish that we were able to do this face-to-face, but we will do the very best that we can. The key theme here that I want to return to throughout this presentation is shown by this photograph here of Winston Churchill, Harry Truman, and Joseph Stalin smiling and shaking hands. And the point that I want really to reiterate here is that these three men and most of the advisors around them did not believe that what they were doing at Potsdam was laying the seeds of a Cold War. We know from the scholarship of the 1960s, 70s, and beyond, a lot of historians read Potsdam backwards. That is to say, they read it as the start of the Cold War. But as this photograph shows here, these three men and their staffs came to Potsdam not to begin a Cold War amongst themselves, but to celebrate, really, the end of the war with Germany, figure out what the post-war world was going to look like, and plan for the final victory over Japan in the Pacific theater. This photograph very much reflects the spirit of Potsdam, which I'll talk about a little bit more in just a bit, which was happy, which was victorious, which was joyful, which was really celebratory in the way that they were looking at the post-war world. Although they had suspicions about one another, and although their countries certainly did not share all interests, very few people left Potsdam believing that relations were going to be very difficult going forward. That illusion is going to get shattered very quickly, I would argue within weeks or months of the end of this conference, but the mood at the conference itself is very different. Mostly what they're trying to do, and this is the second theme that I really want to talk about in tonight's lecture, most of what they're trying to do is avoid what they believed had been the mistakes of their predecessors 25 years earlier. They wanted to avoid the mistakes that the Treaty of Versailles had committed, and I'll talk a bit about what those were. What they really want to do is leave Europe in a better foundation and leave it in a better position than Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George, Georges Clemenceau, and the generation of 1919 had done in Paris. They did not know the future, of course, but they did know the past. And another theme that I was interested in shaping this book and thinking about writing this book is the way that these men of 1945, and they were all men, looked back at 1919 and what they saw and why it mattered to them. And my favorite example of this is what happened to Harry Truman on June 28, 1919, the very day that the Treaty of Versailles was signed in the palace just west of Paris. Harry Truman hopefully was not thinking about international relations very much, because it's the day that he got married. And this is a reminder, too, that these leaders are people. I wrote in the book, and I think I would stay to this, that while one could imagine Joseph Stalin in 1919 or Winston Churchill in 1919 believing that one day they might head their country's governments, it's kind of hard to believe that this guy thought on June 28, 1919, that he would one day lead the government of the United States, yet there he would be down the road. At the moment of the Treaty of Versailles, of course, the world is in the same kind of flux that it's in 1945. There is the same level of confusion. There's the same great power competition. There's the same question of whether an alliance that won a war can also function in the peace. So all of these things are coming back. And as I'll cover also in this lecture, I would argue that with the exception, the one major big exception of the atomic bomb, all of the issues that they discussed at Potsdam would have been quite familiar to people that attended the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. The fundamental issues had not changed, and this is something that they were all aware of. And the other thing that I want to stress before we go any further is that with the exception of Harry Truman, many of the senior people, and Joseph Stalin, many of the senior people who attended the Potsdam Conference had actually been at the Versailles Peace Treaty or had been there for the Paris Peace Conference. They include the American Secretary of State, James Burns, who may well have been the person who convinced Woodrow Wilson to go to Paris in person. They include Churchill, who was there and quite disappointed with the treaty that the great powers produced. They include the great British economist John Maynard Keynes, who was at both Potsdam and at the Paris Peace Conference. So to these people, the Paris Peace Conference is not something that they read about in history books or something that they had a sort of vague memory of. These were fundamental shaping events in their own lives and their own political careers, and they believed that the reason they were here fighting a second world war, closing a second world war, is because of the mistakes that were made at the end of the first. And all of them understood this. When they came to Potsdam in 1945, the very first thing Harry Truman said in his role as President of the United States at the conference was a warning to everybody seated around the table that I'll show you in just a minute, not to repeat the mistakes of 1919. Before going to Potsdam, Joseph Stalin said the same thing to the American Representative Joseph Davies, that the one thing they had to do was make sure they didn't make the same mistakes. So what mistakes did they make? This is, again, one of those things that to me was very interesting, because virtually everybody who came to Potsdam had their own view of what they thought had gone so badly wrong a generation earlier. To John Maynard Keynes and to James Burns, the American Secretary of State, the big mistake had been imposing reparations on Germany, that Germany proved unable to pay, that disrupted the European economy, and that forced the United States, in James Burns's view, to put money into the European system so that some other country would benefit in the form of the Dawes and the Young plans of the 1920s. There was also the argument that shaping the borders that you see here, this is a map of Europe in 1919, after the Paris Peace Conference, that putting a map like this together had also been a mistake, that trying to draw lines around people where they lived had produced states that were either economically unable to feed themselves, unable to contribute to the overall security of the continent, and in some cases creating countries like Yugoslavia and Poland that were simply too multi-ethnic to be able to support any kind of reasonable politics going forward. A third argument, and this is particularly a Soviet one, is that the big mistake they had made in 1919 was to take into account the views of all of the people who lived on this map. Stalin was fond of saying that states were not virtuous simply because they were small or new. So in his view, what had to happen is the great powers simply had to take control of this conference and not allow the voices of people from all over the world to play a role. So unlike the Paris Peace Conference, which involves people from literally every corner of the globe, in Potsdam, the faces will be 95% either Soviet, British, or American. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all of these issues that they're dealing with in 1919 come up again in 1945. What to do with Germany? Whether the great powers should reconstitute Germany or whether they should enact such heavy reparations against Germany that Germany becomes economically barren, in effect, at the end of the war. How to handle the ethnic map of Europe. What role should the United States play? And what role should multilateral organizations play? All of these questions come up in 1919 and they come up again in 1945. And I would argue that in many cases in 1945, they will take almost a 180-degree opposite tack to the one that they took in 1919. Another thing that's very different, of course, is the condition of Germany itself. This is a photograph taken, two photographs taken from roughly the same angle. The picture on the right, that building that is on the far left of the right-hand picture, is the new United States Embassy just outside the Brandenburg Gate on the side that had been East Berlin. The kind of canopy-looking thing in the background there is Potsdam Place, the Potsdamer Platz. The picture on the left is taken at about the same place in 1945. So one clear difference between the Germany of 1919 and the Germany of 1945 is that in the 1919 case, German nationalists could argue that they had not really lost the First World War, that they had been undercut at home, and that the army returned, as one German politician said, undefeated in the field. It's impossible to make that argument in 1945 for the reasons that you can see here. This is done on purpose. The Soviets wanted the Germans, especially the Berliners, to feel the pain of this war. The devastation that is created here in Berlin is so intense that there were many Americans and British observers who came to Potsdam who believed that it could never be rebuilt, that it might almost be better to bulldoze the city and move the German capital someplace else. There were people, including the American Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, who wanted almost exactly that future for Germany. He wanted to deindustrialize it. He wanted to take so much money out of it that it could not rebuild its economy. And he wanted to turn it into a federal system where power would be in the German states and very little power would be in the central government, the so-called Morgenthau Plan. There are legitimate questions being asked in Berlin in 1945. Can the Germans live better than the Russians, the French, the Poles, whom they invaded? How can they possibly be allowed to live better than the Jews who had survived the concentration camps and were now wandering Europe with no place to go? Fundamentally, the other question that involves history here that to me was very interesting, what do the people of 1945 think caused this war? Is it something that is fundamentally wrong with the Germans themselves? If it is, then a long occupation is going to be necessary. Is it simply the bad legacy of Versailles and the Great Depression, which is what John Maynard Keynes believed? If that's the case, then reparations are a terrible idea in Keynes's view. Was the problem a problem of the balance of power in Europe? Did it simply get to the point where nobody could contain or encircle Germany? Each historical understanding comes with a different understanding for what you might want to fix going forward in 1945. What you're going to have to do, of course, is make clear to everybody that this time Germany is completely and utterly defeated. And they will do this at Potsdam, not merely by holding the conference in the suburbs of Berlin, but by ensuring that there are no German faces whatsoever. Potsdam is emptied of Germans by the Red Army before the conference begins, as another symbol that this is over, that the German power is over. And Potsdam is quite symbolic because Frederick the Great's castle, Sanssouci, is there, and the Neue Palace, which is where Wilhelm II signed the order to take Germany to war in 1914, is also in Potsdam. So to the conquering nations, the conquering allies, Potsdam has this symbolism. It is the place where German militarism began. It is the place, in their view, where the First World War began. It will now be the place where the Second World War, at least in Europe, will come to an end. And I can't prove it, but I think the Russians arrived at the conference late in order to make sure that the Americans and British saw Berlin for themselves. President Wilson in 1919 had famously not toured the battlefields because he did not want, as he put it, for his heart to grow hard. What Stalin wanted is for the American and British leadership to see Berlin for themselves, see as much of Germany for themselves as they could. And again, this produces different reactions depending upon one's definition of history. Should the Allies, should the British, French, and Soviets put money into Germany to rebuild this devastation, or should they leave Germany, as one Soviet observer put it, at the margin of subsistence for a significant period of time? Now, this is downtown Berlin. This is Potsdam, the lovely, elegant suburb in which this conference is going to happen. As I said, Potsdam has this old tradition of being the home of the Prussian aristocracy. It also is the place where the German film industry had its headquarters. It is the Hollywood, in effect, of Germany. And those of you who may be watching the television series Babylon Berlin, the second season largely takes place in Potsdam. And the great movie studios of Germany hosted several of the parties that the attendees went to here in 1945. So it has an image of both a kind of old center of German power and a new kind of bourgeois center of power. For that reason, Potsdam is very important. The United States did try to get this conference either in Alaska or in Washington, D.C., in order to get the Soviets to come to the United States, because President Roosevelt had to make that incredibly arduous trip to Yalta. The Soviets were insistent that the conference would only happen in a place where the Red Army could guarantee security. The exact building, the Sicilian Palace, was built in the middle of World War I, which I always find kind of incredible, for the Crown Prince and his wife Cicely. They were to move into it at the end of the First World War, and this was to be their home. So even while Germany is fighting the First World War and trying to win that war, it builds this massive palace to the Crown Prince. This building will become the center, really, of the conference. It's relatively modern. It has electricity in every room. It has modern kitchens. It has enough space that the British, American, and Soviet delegations can all set up offices, which I'll show you here just a bit. When the great powers came to the conference, they saw what you see here. It's still there, that gigantic red star of geraniums that the Soviets had planted to greet the great powers as they showed up. Inside Potsdam and neighboring Babelsberg, the Soviets divided those two areas into three sectors, an American, Soviet, and British sector, to house the great VIPs that had come. This is the back of the palace. It looks out onto a lovely lake. No expense was spared to make this conference the very best that it could be. And one of the things I enjoyed going through were they weren't very extensive, but the papers were very fun, of a woman named Joan Bright, who was the protocol director, and all of the effort that she went to make sure that this conference went just right from the British side. The Soviets brought in the heads of their major hotels as well to make sure that all the hospitality was there. Absolutely no expense spared. Milk was brought in from the United Kingdom. Hams were brought in from Yorkshire. When Harry Truman didn't like the sheet music that was in the palace, he had a U.S. Air Force bomber fly to Paris and bring him back sheet music. So whatever they wanted, they could have. They were literally the conquerors coming to rule over. And again, no German faces anywhere to be seen here in Potsdam. This is the room that Stalin used as his office. For most Soviet leaders, and the Soviets are the hardest group to read here, both because many of their archives are not open, and of course, even if they are open, they're in Russia. But from what we can tell from the primary sources, and there are quite a few contemporary primary sources, the fundamental problem that the Russians saw in the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles that resulted was a failure to build states on the border of Russia that could act as buffers. So this time what the Soviets want are stable, reliable countries that will serve as a buffer, not just between the Soviet Union and Germany, but the Soviet Union and a West that is still seen as a potential security threat to the Soviet Union in the post-war world. The second thing it seems that the Soviets wanted were reparations. They wanted to take as much money and as much industrial assets as they could out of Germany. And eventually they'll take anything that they can get their hands on. They turn entire infantry divisions, 20,000 men strong, and give them the mission of taking everything that they can get their hands on. And they did this in Potsdam itself at the end of the conference. They took books, they took light fixtures, they took everything that they could from the nearby houses and villas. What they didn't want, they threw into that lake that is behind the palace. So literally anything they didn't want, they would fill potholes with, they would just throw it away. So at any rate, the Germans wouldn't get it at the end of the war. They are most concerned with making sure that another invasion does not happen. This is the office for the study that Harry Truman used. And Truman is a particularly sympathetic figure to me, because when he became president of the United States in April of 1945, despite the bad health that President Roosevelt was in, Truman is kept almost completely in the dark on what American policy is. And in fact, when he became president, he asked to see the transcripts of the Yalta Conference so that he could figure out what the United States had agreed to do at Yalta, only to find that those transcripts apparently didn't exist. So Truman is having to figure out what America agreed to at Yalta by talking to people who were there and getting contradictory information and contradictory reports. Truman, as a senator, had found a gap in the U.S. Defense Department's budget that he challenged the U.S. Army on. He challenged the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, on. And Stimson told him that he understood that Truman was a senator, but he could not share what that was for. It's only after Truman became president that Stimson pulled him aside and explained to him what the Manhattan Project was. That's what Truman had stumbled on earlier on in the war. So one thing that Harry Truman is certainly interested in is trying to get a handle on what his new responsibilities are. He's interested in what we would today call a reset of relations with the Soviet Union. Truman thinks that if he can just look the Soviet leaders in the eyes, he can cut a deal with them. He wants Soviet help in defeating Japan in the Pacific Theater. He wants to be sure that the Soviet Union will participate fully in the United Nations and in some of the other organizations that the United States is trying to build. And he wants to create a balanced Europe that hopefully will mean that the United States does not have to send an army back to Europe for a third world war. It's for this reason that Truman tried to delay the Potsdam Conference for as long as he could, both to give himself time to get up to speed on all of these issues and hopefully to give the scientists in New Mexico a little bit more time to work on the Manhattan Project. The weakest of the three great powers is undoubtedly the British, and I love this photograph because it is taken at a rather silly moment when they lay out three chairs, as you see here, for the press to take pictures. Originally, Churchill was supposed to have the middle chair. When the photographers told him he had to move to the chair you see occupying our left, he did so quite grudgingly, and then as you can see in this photograph, he began to move his chair closer and closer and closer to Truman's. What he wanted to send was a message, and this isn't the only time he did this, that there's an Anglo-American unity here, that the United States and Britain are on the same page. And you can see the look in Harry Truman's eyes. He's having none of it. So he started to move his chair closer and closer to the center. Churchill was aware that America's interests and Britain's interests were beginning to diverge. Britain was going to have to spend some resources to rebuild its empire, something the United States under both Roosevelt and Truman had said they were not interested in doing. Britain wants to be sure that the United States will in fact commit to Europe at all. At Potsdam, Truman says repeatedly that he does not want the United States to have a long-term permanent presence in Europe. He wants to help the Europeans get themselves back on their feet, and then he wants the United States to go back to our side of the Atlantic Ocean. It's also, of course, the case that Truman knows that there is a war still to be won with Japan, and that American military force will have to be diverted to do that. So as I mentioned in the book, it is Stalin who decides where this conference will be. It is Truman who decides when this conference is going to be. The only thing that Churchill is able to decide is the code name of the conference, which he decides will be codenamed Terminal. It's also true that Churchill tried everything that he could to get Truman to come to London first before going to Potsdam, and Truman repeatedly refused. At one point, he said he would not allow the conference to be simply a continuation of Anglo-American discussions. So Churchill's trying to, as his foreign minister, Anthony Eden, said, win on the power of his personality. And that's going to be difficult for a country that will come out of the war victorious, but knows it's going to come out of the war in a relatively poor position. This is a picture that I also wanted to show just because of the smiling faces. Everybody's but Chip Bolin, who's there in the dead center. He's Truman's Russia specialist and Russia translator. The two men on the right are Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, and James Burns, the new American Secretary of State. And this is genuine. I don't think they're mugging for the cameras here. They are genuinely delighted that they're meeting in Potsdam, that they have defeated Nazi Germany together. And there is certainly, as I said, a suspicion that all of this loveliness and friendship and hugging and kissing might not last forever. But at least at this moment in Potsdam, they see themselves as conquering heroes altogether. And again, as I mentioned, the three great powers have decided that they will be the only people who will be here. France does not get an invitation. Harry Truman was furious with Charles de Gaulle for de Gaulle's rather rude treatment of Roosevelt during the war, and Truman told James Burns' aide, if I want to see de Gaulle, I will send for him just as I would the head of any other minor power, which is a great line. Poland is not invited to the conference either, except to give a very brief statement on one day of the conference to present their various positions. So it is the great powers who are going to run this and make these decisions. This is the table in the main conference room inside the palace. It is intentionally kept small to limit the number of people who can attend. Only the people who are sitting at the table are allowed really to have a voice. The people that you see in the back are there to be advisors. They're there to be translators. And several of them who left memoirs say they spent an awful lot of time cleaning those ashtrays. So you can see that the room is red. That's also by design. And you can see the way that they're starting to think about what they want when push comes to shove in setting the future of Europe. The Treaty of Versailles analogy is not the only historical analogy that they talk about. Some of the American hardliners and British hardliners also talk about the Munich analogy, that they need to be very careful that what they do with the Soviets is sufficiently strong so that the Soviets don't take advantage of the generosity of the West. They don't want to be in a position where the Soviets come out of this conference too strong. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Anybody who wanted to make that point could use the dreaded word appeasement, a very loaded word, of course, in 1945, a word that remains quite loaded. The big question for the United States has to be, what do we think the Soviet Union wants? What are they? What can we expect them to do? Before becoming president of the United States, Truman noted he had never even met a Russian. The first Russian that he meets is Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, whose nickname is Stone Ass among the American diplomatic corps because of his ability to just sit there silently and with no emotion on his face at all when he didn't want to reveal anything that he was thinking. He must have been a very, very difficult person to play poker against, a game that Truman was very, very good at. So Truman assembles his Russia team, and he finds that there's very little agreement among even his senior Soviet advisors. And you can see the three most important are sitting right there. Averell Harriman, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, is not in this photograph. He's the hardliner of the four. There are at least three ways of thinking about what the Soviet Union will do in the post-war period. One way of thinking, which is expressed by Robert Lovett and the so-called softliners that also include Joseph Davies, is that what the Soviets really want is, in effect, really no different from what the Tsar wanted in 1914. That is to say, the problem isn't really ideological. The problem is that just like the Tsar, what Stalin will want is security on his western frontier and access through the Dardanelles Straits in the south to renegotiate something called the Montreux Convention of 1936, to allow Soviet ships to pass through the Dardanelles Straits unblocked, unhindered. Unhindered is the word I wanted, sorry. So by this logic, you don't really need to think about an ideological conflict with the Soviet Union, and you don't need to worry about giving the Soviet Union an opening into places where they're unlikely to go. The second way of thinking largely comes from Chip Bolin and Averell Harriman, who argue that this really is something different, that what you're seeing in the Soviet Union is not like the Tsar's system, because this truly is a different ideology, that the Soviets will not feel safe until the moment when they think that most of the world agrees with them ideologically, or until they fully control them. So in Bolin's mind, the United States has to be prepared to deal with Soviet expansion. It has to be prepared for the Soviets to continually be testing the limits of what the West is willing to do. The third one, and I have to say, I'm still, when I read George Kennan's writings all these years later, I am amazed by both his ability to look backwards and to look forwards. Kennan wrote very perceptively to Truman that the problem with the Soviet system is that while the United States and the British will come out of the Second World War feeling triumphant, the Soviets will come out, despite being the great victors of the war, they'll come out of the war with their paranoia vastly increased. Kennan argued that the problem that the Soviet Union had was not so much its geopolitical one. The problem that it had is that its system fundamentally doesn't work in peacetime, that it wasn't working in the 1930s, and once economic conditions of the post-war world came back, the economic conditions of the Soviet Union won't work in the 1950s and 60s either. Nevertheless, he argued, because the Soviets came out of the Second World War so paranoid, and because they would have the balance of military power in their hands, any military attempt by the United States or Great Britain to force the Russians into doing something that they don't want to do will be met with force. So if the United States wants to try to push the Soviets around in Europe, they have to expect that it's going to have to be done with full military force in place, and that the United States can't do. So Kennan's argument, it later becomes known as the containment doctrine. His argument is that what the United States should do is try to limit Soviet influence as much as the United States can in places where it can do so relatively cheap. Contain the Soviet Union and allow the internal contradictions of the Soviet Union to work against it. Wait for the Soviet people themselves to realize that this system is not workable. And Kennan was aware that this could take decades to achieve. So what he's arguing to Truman is patience, build up the West. In effect, he's arguing for creating a bipolar world, one pole led by the United States, one pole led by the Soviet Union. And what Kennan wants to do, therefore, is build up the democratic systems of Western Europe and the post-war world, and later, of course, to build up through the Marshall Plan the economies of the West as well. And if that means shutting the Soviets out of the system, that's an outcome that is perfectly acceptable to Kennan. The litmus test here is going to be how the Soviets come to Potsdam on Poland. What will they want to do on Poland? If the Soviets push for an expansive Poland pushed further to the west, and if they insist on shutting the democratic Polish government, the Polish government in exile, a group called the London Poles, if they insist on excluding the London Poles, then those will be indications that the Soviets are willing to play hardball. If the Soviets are willing to open up Poland to fair and free elections, that's a different case. The question that Kennan asks Truman is, if they don't do what we want them to do, what choice does the United States really have on Poland? In other words, if Poland is a reason for Britain and France to go to war in 1939, is it a reason for the United States to go to war with the Soviet Union in 1945? And all four of the men in this photograph have the same answer. No, it is not. One more thing about Potsdam that to me was endlessly fascinating, and I can talk about it more in the question and answer if anybody's interested. I'm always interested in this question. I was trained as a social historian not to think that individuals are terribly important to the overall course of history, that it is larger patterns and larger structures that are more important than individual decisions and individual bits of contingency most of the time. And Potsdam offers a really fascinating insight here. Truman became president upon FDR's death in April. He brings a new national security team in with him, including a new Secretary of State in James Burns. And in the middle of the Potsdam Conference, the votes are tabulated in the first British election since the mid-1930s. And to everyone's tremendous shock, the Labour Party, led by this man, Clement Attlee, on the left, thoroughly defeats Winston Churchill's Conservatives. So the conference takes a break in the middle. The British go back to London in order to monitor the results of the election. Famously in number 10 and number 10 Downing Street, they take down the battle maps of Western Europe, and they put up the electoral maps to try to figure out how things are going. And Attlee wins. So the question we really have here is, how much do the policies change when Attlee and Truman replace FDR and Winston Churchill? And in my view, and in the view of people who were living through it at the time, the answer is really not very much. Anthony Eden, who is replaced as the British Prime Minister by Ernest Bevin, was very attentive to this. Eden was very worried because Bevin, the foreign minister, had very little experience in foreign affairs. Eden is very concerned that they're going to flub this up. They're going to mess up Britain's position. And at the end, he writes in his diary in a very long and detailed and very thoughtful explanation that the tone might have been a little bit different, but Attlee and Bevin did the same things that Churchill and he had done, mostly because they were in the same strategic position of not having any money. The United States is going to do something a little bit different. Truman and Roosevelt before him had already planned on this. Unlike Woodrow Wilson in 1919, who went in trying to win with the power of ideas, Truman wanted to come in with a bunch of really good cards in his hand. One of them is having the United Nations Charter already signed before Truman went to Potsdam. That occurs here, as you can see, in late June 1945, and with the United States Senate having already approved American membership. So there'll be no fight over the League of Nations like there was in 1919. The difference, of course, is that this time the United States will have one of 5 Security Council vetoes, so that the UN, unlike the League of Nations, can never do harm to the United States because it has that UN Security Council veto. The United States also was careful to make sure that the conference was held in San Francisco and that the international headquarters of the United Nations would be built on the east side of New York City. The United States also created monetary institutions. This is John Maynard Keynes here in the middle. That are today known as the Bretton Woods agreements. They include what became the World Bank. They include currency set to the US dollar and backed by American gold so that exchange rates are fixed. They include really the United States taking control of the global economy and moving it from London to New York. John Maynard Keynes, in the middle here, probably the most famous economist of his age, called this system a swindle, That is, he knew that the United States was using its military power and its diplomatic power to undercut Britain's economic power, but he also was perfectly aware that Britain had no choice. Famously, he said that Britain could not possibly police half the world while remaining in debt to the other half. The officials of the Bank of England, who were also at Bretton Woods, said that this was actually the only thing worse than losing the war, because under the Bretton Woods system, all of the British Empire, India, Singapore, all of it would have to be open to the United States on fair and equal trade terms, which in effect, Keynes knew, meant the end of the British Empire at some point. The irony here is that Britain, being the least powerful of the big three, ended up making very similar arguments that they rejected when France made them in 1919. In effect, we know we're out of money, we know we don't have the military power that we once had, but we sacrificed and bled on the battlefield with you. Isn't that worth something? They reject that argument when the French make it in 1919. The United States and the Soviets reject it when the British make it in 1945. So Keynes is another one of these extremely perceptive people able to look backwards and forwards. He believed that the economic conditions that the Second World War had created might well lead to another Great Depression that is largely averted by the Marshall Plan, some good luck, and some very good thinking by European economists. But he also was aware, as I mentioned earlier, that this likely means the end of Great Britain as a great power, and it likely means the end of the imperial system as the British had known it. The last card in Truman's hand that I want to talk about is, of course, the atomic bomb that is detonated in New Mexico as the Potsdam Conference is going on. The American Secretary of War slips Truman a note. It's a kind of poorly coded note that lets him know exactly how successful this had been. That is, how far away could the explosion be heard, and how far away could the explosion be seen. Truman got that note. He was perfectly well aware. They had discussed what they would do, how they would present it to the Soviets, how they would open this discussion. And the decision that they made was that Truman would go up to Stalin after the end of one of the sessions and mention it without using the word atomic, and to mention it in as low-key a way as it was possible to do. Now, what Truman and Churchill did not know, what nobody on the Western side knew, is that the Soviets also knew how close the United States was to an atomic bomb. They too had discussed how Stalin should respond if Churchill and Truman mentioned the atomic bomb, mentioned the success of the Alamogordo experiment to him. And they had agreed that he would try to downplay it as much as possible, and he would try to make it seem as though he didn't fully understand the consequences of what they're saying. And to me, this is another thing that as an historian was very interesting. I would have thought that everybody would remember that moment when Truman pulled Stalin aside because everybody knew that it was coming. And in fact, people's historical recollections do not overlap terribly well, which I find very interesting. The consensus seems to be that Truman mentioned the new super weapon that the United States had developed, again, avoiding the term atomic. Stalin saying something like, that's good, we'll use it against Japan, or that's good, that's wonderful, and then walking away. And Truman and Churchill both noted in their recollections of this that they thought that Stalin had no idea what had just been told to him. Now, again, we know that's not true. And as it turns out, the conversation that they had just had was a conversation over the future of Poland that had had some pretty tense exchanges. Stalin read that, as he told one of his advisors, as atomic blackmail. So the nuclear age is just about to begin. Truman made the decision that the United States should not drop the bomb over Hiroshima until he, Truman, was already back at sea on the way back to the United States. That is, he wanted to be literally at sea when it was first used. He wanted to be in a position where he would not have to discuss this with Stalin in any way. Okay, so what did they decide at Potsdam? Well, one thing that they decided was on the boundaries of Germany. They actually divide three countries here. They break three countries into pieces here. It's an afterthought. It's almost done by lower level officials. One of these decisions is made by a colonel back in Washington, D.C. named Dean Rusk, who later becomes Secretary of State. His decision is to divide the Korean Peninsula in two. They also decide here that they will divide the French colony of Indochina into two. What they'll do here in Germany is break Germany. First, what they'll do is they'll break it into three occupation zones: the Soviet, British, American, and the French zone. And you can see it here from the map. The French zone is carved out of the American American zone. That is, the Soviets are okay with the French having their own zone of occupation as long as it's not coming out of the Soviet zone. The same thing will happen here with Berlin. And the decision that they reach is that each side will take out or put into its zone whatever it wants. And the reason they're doing this is the American fear that if Germany is treated as a single unit, if it's treated as a single thing for occupation reasons, then the Soviets will simply take advantage to take everything they can out of Germany, forcing the United States and Great Britain to put money into Germany. So in effect, the US will be putting resources into Germany while the Soviets take them out. This is exactly the nightmare scenario that Burns thought of from 1919, and it's the scenario he does not want to see repeated here in 1945. Now, they don't envision at this point that this will become two different states. We know now, of course, that they do, with the United States, Britain, and France putting resources into the western zone of Germany, and the Soviets taking everything they can find that isn't nailed down out of the eastern sector. And this, of course, those of you in Germany or those who travel to Germany will know this remains an issue inside Germany, where the economic development of the East still lags a bit in many ways behind the West. Nevertheless, the United States gets what it wants. It gets a system where it doesn't have to put money into a reparations scheme while the Soviets pull those resources out. The second decision that they make, and this is mostly a Soviet one that the United States has to acquiesce in as it's happening, the decision that's made this time is that rather than draw lines around countries exclusively, what the Red Army will do is force people to move into their new ethnic areas. So if you are German, living in what will become Poland, the Red Army will encourage you to leave. And this is going to happen to millions and millions of people. At Potsdam, the United States knows that the Soviet Union is doing this. They know that in that shaded area that you see that becomes part of Poland, they are taking away Lutheran churches and sacralizing them as Catholic churches. They are taking down German street signs and putting up Polish ones. They are, for all intents and purposes, taking those regions and making them Polish. And they'll do this throughout the map of Europe. And the Soviet expectation here is that this is the way that you're going to end the problem of what to do with displaced persons and what to do with the boundary lines here. The big problem is what to do with the Jewish survivors of the concentration camps. And this, of course, will lead into the decision to see Palestine as a solution. But here at Potsdam, I was quite surprised by what they don't talk about. And the main thing that they don't talk about is what to do with these Jews and what to do with the future of Palestine. The key thing, I think, is that for the people of 1945, the problem of Germany had been solved as they understood it. The occupation lines had been decided, even if it was believed that those would be temporary. That would give them an ability to monitor Germany. The size of Germany is made smaller, mostly as Poland grows a little bit more, and I'll show you that in just a second. And also the ability to make sure that the economics of Germany are going to work, at least in the Western zone, the way that the United States and Britain want them to work. Now, the people that pay the price, of course, are the Poles. And this map here shows what became known as Poland sliding to the west. So the map that's on the left here is the dark part of that map is the Polish boundary of really 1921 at the end of World War I. The light color that's there, you can see the line that's built there, is the new Poland that's drawn in 1945. And supposedly Winston Churchill demonstrated this at Yalta with 3 matchsticks and rolling them to the left. So the phrase that has been used ever since is that Poland slides to the west. So that part in the east is taken away from Poland, which includes the city of Lvov, which was then ethnically, had a large ethnic population of Poles. And then the part of East Prussia, that is the kind of the heartland of old Germany, becomes part of Poland. So the city of Posen becomes the Polish city of Poznań as Poland begins to move to the west. Now, the Americans are aware that there's not a heck of a lot that they can do about this. They had hoped to put some faith in the ability of a democratic government in Poland to at least decide what kind of government Poland would have. And it becomes perfectly obvious at the Potsdam Conference that the Soviets have no intention of allowing anything that would even remotely resemble free elections. This is, I think, along with the atomic bomb, one of the 2 issues that really does begin to create difficulties and suspicions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Poland pays the price. It remains, of course, under Soviet dominance until the late 1980s, early 1990s. And I love what George Kennan had to say here about this. He said, "I wish that instead of mumbling words of official optimism, we had had the judgment and the good taste to bow our heads in silence before the tragedy of a people who have been our allies, whom we have helped to save from our enemies, and who we cannot save from our friends." And Arthur Bliss Lane, the American ambassador to Poland, wrote a book with this title that you see above there, "I Saw Poland Betrayed." Well, we can fast forward to a really remarkable world today in 2020, where both Germany and Poland are full members of NATO, they're full members of the European Union, they're full members of a multilateral and international system that, if they didn't exactly design it at Potsdam, they certainly would not have been terribly surprised. And in fact, I think most people outside the Soviet bloc would have been very pleased with the outcome that you see here. So this is, I think, a reminder both that history is always moving, it is always changing, it is always dynamic, it is never done with us. It is always a factor in the way that we have to think about the past, the present, and the future. So if the leaders of 1945 did not yet know the contours of the future that they were trying to create, I would argue, they at least knew the past that they wanted very much not to repeat. Thank you very much, and I will be happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Michael, for a wonderful presentation. If you have a question and haven't added it to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, please do so now. You can also like a question that's already been submitted that you would like to see answered. All right, and our first question is, if Truman needed information about Yalta, why didn't he go to London and meet with Churchill before going to Potsdam?
So there were arguments. I don't think it would have been possible for Truman to go to London. There were arguments that there's simply too much that Truman had to do in the United States. There were too many people he had to meet, too many things he had to organize. There was a question of Churchill coming to Washington for Roosevelt's funeral, and that would have been an opportunity for the United States and British leaders to sit down. He never did explain it, but one day Churchill just told his staff, "I'm not going to Washington. We're not going to do that." And when when Churchill decided not to come for the funeral, that opportunity, I think, for a large gathering of sort of meeting of the minds would not have happened. I also think it's true that James Burns, the new Secretary of State, who is very close to Truman at this point, they later have a rupture, they have a rupture later, was trying to make sure that whatever Truman did, he did not get his information from the British, that it should come from American sources. So Burns takes charge of, Burns was at Yalta, so he was physically there, although he did not play a very important role. He and Roosevelt had a falling out. It's kind of a pattern of Burns's life. So the simple answer is that there was no real opportunity to do that because of Churchill's decision not to come to Washington. And I think, again, Burns would have frowned upon that. So instead, what Burns does, he's the guy that ends up really taking control and telling Truman, look, this is what I remember from Yalta. This is what I remember that we agreed to do.
All right. Our next question is from Stan, and it says, did President Truman later express any regrets about decisions made at Potsdam, especially in regard to Poland?
He did. In fact, in his major speech on the agreement to the American people, right after he got back to the United States, he comes right out and says it, that the Polish part, he says, is the part that I was most uncomfortable with. But he in effect says to his advisors, look, there's nothing we could have done. The only way to force the Soviets to do anything different on Poland would have been to threaten them with military action, and it's just not going to happen. It's not in the cards. Those of you who know from the movie Patton, I mean, this is, at least allegedly, this is what George Patton was arguing, that you have to threaten the Soviets with military action, force them to go back to their side of the Polish border, prevent some border like this one from being created. But it's A, unrealistic, and B, not the job of a general to make those decisions.
All right, our next question comes from Elaine, and it says, why did they not address the issue of Jewish refugees?
So that's, it's really hard when you go through Truman and Churchill's briefing books are both in the archives. So the Truman briefing book is there at the Truman Library, and you can see exactly what he was reading, the same exact book that he was reading. I think there's two reasons. I think one is that Palestine was still a British mandate at that point. It still technically belonged to Great Britain. So if you're going to open up the issue of Palestine, then you have to open up a whole lot of issues about the internal affairs of the great powers. And I don't think anybody wanted to cross that line at this conference. The second thing, and it's curious, when you read the initial reports of the liberation of the camps, the word Jewish is not used very often. So if you read Edward R. Murrow, um, um, Dorothy Thompson is there, Martha Gellhorn, the reports that they send back don't specifically refer to Jews. So there is a sense, and I'm not really sure how much this is getting back to the folks at Potsdam, that Jewish suffering is no different from the suffering of Europeans more generally, that there isn't something distinct and unique. Now, to Truman's great credit and Churchill's great credit, they soon woke up to that reality, and Truman assigned Earl Harrison to come to Europe and write a report, the very famous report that Harrison writes back to Truman that says, we're treating the Jews the same way the Nazis did, except that we're not killing them. In other words, we're keeping them in these camps. So to their credit, they had an epiphany later, but I think largely it was the unwillingness of Truman to open up, or certainly the unwillingness of Churchill, to open up what they saw as internal affairs of the great powers to this conference. And Palestine is considered part of the internal affairs of Great Britain.
All right, our next question comes from Ian, and it says, it seems that the true takeaway for great power competition from Potsdam is that force, or the threat of force, decides diplomacy. Would you agree?
There's that great old expression that diplomacy is the art of saying nice doggy until you can find a really big rock. In the Army War College where I teach, we use a very simplified thing. We call it the DIME: diplomacy, information, military, and economics. And ideally, you want all four of those things to function together. So military force is always there. The official motto of where I work is not to prepare for war, but to promote peace. So the ultimate idea of where I work is to teach senior military officers the ways that one can use military force in exactly the way you're articulating, to pursue state interests short of violence. That's the ideal. It doesn't always, of course, work out that way. I think what we're seeing in the 21st century are states like Russia and China who are using information, and in the Chinese case, economics, in place of military force to support their diplomacy. And this has been part of the challenge that I think we're dealing with in the 21st century, that the tools of statecraft are different in the 21st century than they were in 1945. This, I think, is the real challenge going forward for Western societies, which I think bad actors around the world have figured out is the way to exploit Western societies because of their openness. So I would say that, you know, all of those four factors, diplomacy, information, military, and economics, work together. Military force, the folks that I work for will say that it is the ultimate thing that you want to hold back. So without military power, the rest, you don't have a plan B with anything, but it should never be plan A. You should always let the others work their way out first.
All right. Our next question comes from James, and it's a bit of a long one. You state that the Allies at Potsdam were optimistic and buoyant, indeed celebratory. But surely if this was true, the positive and collaborative relations between them rapidly disappeared, did it not? What specific important agreements were made at Potsdam rather than being differed as they were to the Council of Foreign Ministers because they could not agree on much at Potsdam?
Yeah, so the other thing about Potsdam that Truman remembered, that Truman wanted to avoid, was obviously the very nasty, very bitter fight that Wilson had with the Senate over the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. So Potsdam does not produce a treaty. So for that reason, while there are sort of aid memoirs and while there are memoranda of each day's discussions, they don't produce a formal treaty, and that's by design. That is exactly, as 100% by design. So the Council of Foreign Ministers, as you mentioned, they are there to kind of massage this process going forward. The specific points of disagreement for the United States especially are Soviet treatment of Poland and the general sort of blackout, the inability of American and British officials to move through the Soviet zone of Germany. So that the idea to the Americans, the notion is that the Soviets aren't playing fair. They're not letting us come into the zone. They're treating it as two countries when we were supposed to be treating it as one, just managed by the four powers. For the Soviets, it really is the use of the nuclear bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the timing of the way that Truman did it, so that there's no opportunity for negotiation, there's no opportunity for discussion about what's going to go forward. And the third issue that is really of great concern to everybody is the Chinese Civil War that is ongoing at the same time. So that if you think of the world as a bipolar Soviet-led one pole and American-led other pole, obviously the future of China is going to be incredibly important, as it remains so today. So those are the three issues that emerge very, very quickly. Others, of course, emerge as well. But I think I would still hold to the fact that they left Potsdam. Everybody that left a record of it at the time, everybody that wrote something down in August 1945, all wrote, look, we understand this is not going to be all champagne and strawberries, but we think we can work with these guys. We think this can work. And then by 47, even late 46, that mood is starting to change.
All right, I think we have time for a few more questions. The next question is from Philip, and it says, how long did it take for President Truman to learn of the success of the nuclear bomb test in New Mexico and tell Stalin and Churchill, or was it Attlee?
It was Churchill who was with Truman at that point. So Truman is told almost one of the first briefings he gets after being sworn in as president. He's fully read into what the Manhattan Project is. He's told at Potsdam, I don't remember the exact date, but it's early in the conference. He's handed this memo that says, yeah, it worked. And again, the memo is, if any Soviet saw that memo, they would understand exactly what it said. I mean, it's the most poorly coded thing in all the years of working in archives that I've ever seen. It's no great surprise, which tells me that the Americans didn't think they really had to encode it all that much, because they didn't think the Soviets would understand it, even if it were encoded. And they made the decision, Churchill and Truman and I think a couple of advisors met quickly and said, what should we do about this? And they decided to go ahead with the plan that they had gone with. So it all happens very, very quickly. And again, the key thing to me is that the Americans didn't think that the Soviets had fully grasped what had happened. The Soviets had fully grasped what had happened. And it is something that greatly increases that paranoia that George Kennan had talked about.
All right, and our last question comes from Claire, and it says, how much influence do you think Burns had on Truman's immediate thinking at Potsdam and in the earliest days of the emerging Cold War?
I think Burns is the second most important person that Truman is talking with. The most important, I think, is probably George Marshall, because Truman revered George Marshall. Burns is James Burns is the only man in American history to be on the Supreme Court, the House of Representatives, the Senate, the Cabinet, and a governorship, although the governorship comes after the war, governor of South Carolina. So he knows everybody. He knows where the bodies are buried. He knows how to get things moved through the various branches of government. Everybody in 1944 thought that Burns was going to be the vice president. And if that had happened, then when Roosevelt died, Burns would have been president. So he's the guy that's really whispering in Truman's ear. The legend goes that he's the last person in Washington to stop calling him Harry and start calling him President Truman, because they knew each other so well, and they needed each other so much that they had this kind of informality between them. And Burns's assistant talks about the two of them on the trip back from Potsdam, just sitting together over a bottle of bourbon every day and just talking about things every single day. So the relationship is really close. It will break down quickly. So I think Burns is the most important voice talking to Truman. He had been at Yalta. He had been at, I think, Tehran. He had been at the Paris Peace Conference. He's an unbelievably, enormously influential person. And I think he's probably the most important person in 20th century American history that most Americans don't know anything about. And he's just everywhere. And like Truman, never went to college, very much a self-made, self-taught man. He's the last Supreme Court justice without a law degree. Just a very unpleasant guy. I mean, I should say, a very accomplished, interesting guy, but a diehard segregationist. He's one of the people who gets the Dixiecrat movement going. But in 1945, he's someone that Truman is listening to, as I said, along with Marshall, and with very, very close attention.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Oh, goodness. And I'm so sorry. Here we go. And thanks everyone for joining us today. To find more information about the renovation project currently taking place at the library, you can visit our website at trumanlibraryinstitute.org. We've just launched a detailed timeline of the renovation that features behind-the-scenes images and videos. You can also find more information about the future programs commemorating the 75th anniversary of Truman's presidency, like the ones listed here. Be sure to follow the Truman Library Institute on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for all things Truman, and Michael Neiberg at his website and on Twitter at Michael Neiberg. Thanks again, Michael, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.